usually he'll start talking before it's battle.
Welcome. We hope you enjoy your time with us and you learn a lot and you come back next year too. As forgotten as you think. Who here has ever heard of the Star-Spangled Banner? Raise your hands. Great. Guess what? That happened. It was written by Francis Scott Key when he witnessed the defense of Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. Who here has ever heard of Old Ironsides? Good. That, again, War of 1812. There's so many key moments that happened during the War of 1812 that really solidified the founding of our country. So obviously, the Revolution, we became a country and said, we want to exit Great Britain, we want to be our own sovereign government. But it took a while to really figure that out and to hammer that in. It's often thought and said that after the American Revolution, the Brits really never left. Well, the War of 1812 solidified that. So sometimes it can be confusing, and people think that it was part of the American Revolution. Some people, even a further stretch, can get it confused with the Civil War, which began 50 years after the War of 1812 ended, so don't get it confused. There's a pretty big lapse in time there. So now, it's not the forgotten war. You all have a better grasp on it. The Native Indian tribes on the western frontier had been ongoing since the 1700s. This pressure on its western border presented a serious problem to the underprepared and ill-trained American army, who were now engaged with a professional, well-trained opponent. Realizing the Indian threat to the frontier, General William Henry Harrison ordered a strike against the villages along the Mississippi River, believed to be allied with the British. The strike force would be commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William B. Campbell. The route to the Mississippi Indian villages started in the state of Ohio. Campbell's force traveled about 40 miles from Ohio into Indiana in 2 days. The third day, moving both night and day on a forced march, they went the last 40 miles to the Mississippi Indian villages. As I mentioned earlier, it was in December. The entire trip was in very deep snow and about 20-degree temperature. The night march was so the army could surprise the Indians. Along the way, Campbell's scouts made several mistakes. These mistakes postponed the planned night attack, delaying it well after daylight. So if you can imagine having to walk or ride a horse from Ohio in December, freezing cold. In only 2 days' time. About a half to 1 mile from the village, some Indians, out catching some horses, were discovered at the same time they discovered the army. You may notice here, in the far right corner of the battlefield, 2 natives out looking for some horses. Pay attention to the right corner. Thinking they were attacking Silver Hills town, Campbell's troops made an immediate charge before the residents could be warned. So you're noticing those 2 natives that were surprised by Campbell's troops arriving. You'll notice that the first American casualty was taken by friendly fire, meaning his own soldiers, fellow soldiers, shot him. Then you'll notice that the 2 natives that were out were soon fired upon and killed. Forming a line more than half-mile along, the troops raced towards the village. The left part of the line entered and captured the village before the rest of the troops could get there. So you're going to start to see that forming up. You're now noticing the American regulars entering the field, or now arriving. There were 4 Indian villages along the Mississippi River between here and Peru. The reason why the soldiers were assigned to come here and seek out these villages was because this was the wild frontier at the time. In 1812, Indiana was not a state. And the natives were causing issues to the Americans, pushing westward, allying with the British, causing problems with the War of 1812. Now notice that the warriors of the native village have recognized what's happening. Much of the village is now escaping. The warriors have pushed forward. The Indian A few Indians crossed over the river and fired from that side. But on the whole, it was not a large battle. The Native Americans that were in these villages were Miami Indians and Delaware Indians. You'll notice the women and children escaping and the front line pushing towards. This was not a large battle. The results were that 8 Indian men were killed and 42 were taken prisoners. Only 8 of the prisoners were men. The rest being women and children. The actual village had about 12 huts. And only of those 12 huts, 2 or 3 were left standing to hold the prisoners. The rest were burned. You're now noticing the regulars taking the captives, the women and the children. You only see a few horses on the battlefield right now, but imagine 600 mounted horses that came from Ohio. You'll now notice that they are marching back with the captives. The soldiers destroyed the village, destroyed the corn, and burned most of the huts. The wigwams, like I talked to you about earlier. And that's what you'll be noticing now, the destroying of the village. After the attack, it was discovered that this was not Silver Heels village as they thought it was. More than likely, it was a Delaware Indian village. While the dragoons went downriver to attack more Indian villages, the infantry stayed back to guard the prisoners and set up camp for the night, which you will now begin to see in the center of the battlefield. You'll notice the burning of the wigwam. You'll notice that the prisoners are now in the middle. The army set up the same type of encampment it had used on the march to Mississinewa. A square was formed by the men and their horses. 60 yards away from each corner of the square was a small outpost. Here, Campbell placed his outer guard.
We weren't down this far. Yeah, we were.
corner readouts. Each side of the square was made up of men posted from each unit. Of Campbell's force, a third of the men were always on guard. They were placed close enough to each other to prevent Indian infiltration going unnoticed. Behind them were the horses, the men off guard in their fire. The defenses were what the army would have liked. Many of their axes had broken on the trip there. Felling trees for a defensive perimeter became problematic. The size of the square is estimated to have been 500 feet on each side. When Campbell, who had been attacking other villages, arrived back, he was unhappy with the campsite. He thought it was too big for the total number of men comprising his command. Though apprehensive of its layout, Colonel Campbell made no changes to the command's placement within the square. You'll notice the camp being formed, soldiers being placed appropriately, protecting each corner. On the morning of December 18th, the men woke about 4 a.m. In later accounts, some say this was normal. Some others thought there was a false alarm. Campbell called an officers' meeting to talk about what they should do. All realized their mission had not been met. Against them was the weather. It was cold and bitter. They were also very low on supplies. A half hour before sunrise, and in the middle of the officers' conference, the Indians attacked. The Indians started their attack at the right rear of the square, starting at the outpost that had been put there. This post was under command of Captain Benoni Pierce. He would be the first man killed in battle. Pierce sacrificed his life so his troopers posted there could fall back to the main line in safety. You'll notice the first three men in the first redoubt here on the left. A man with a black and red striped hunting frock behind the two other men. That's Captain Benoni Pierce. You'll now see him in front of the other two men, giving them cover to fall back. And this is when he met his fate. And was the first casualty of actual battle during the Battle of Mississinawa. Firmly now in Indian control, Pierce's outpost gave them an important tactical location for shooting into Campbell's position. Inside the Americans' camp, the campfires were put out, and the army quickly moved back to the line of horses. The native warriors would soon to begin to advance on the encampment. You'll now notice them advancing. You'll now begin to notice orders from the Americans to fall back. Fighting now moved to the right of the Army Square. Pressure was being put on the unit stationed there. Campbell now began moving troops from one side of the square to bolster the area that was then under attack. If you can imagine, like I said, we're trying to represent the battle. There were over 200 native warriors that responded. Guides with the expedition ordered the men to fire as units. It was the best way they felt to blunt the forces of the Indian attack. Campbell had some thoughts about moving some other units, but decided against it. After daybreak, the Indians reduced the amount of firing on the right. This lull gave Campbell the time he needed to launch the counterattack. After 2 charges by the American troops, the Indians left the battle. As they left, they carried their wounded. The engagement lasted about an hour or less. 7 American soldiers were killed during the battle, but several more would die on the way back to Ohio. Only a part of Campbell's force was involved in the fighting. Indian numbers were thought to be about 300. This was only a guess, as nobody knows for sure. In the silence that followed the battle, 15 dead Indian warriors remained on the field. The small army was alone with their prisoners. They were in possession of the battleground. Campbell now was in serious trouble. Over half of his men were severely frostbitten. 44 troopers had been wounded, almost 1/2 of those grievously. They were burdened with prisoners, some of them wounded. Plus, over 100 of Campbell's horses, his main mode of entry and egress from this hostile countryside, were dead. He had only one option. This was to fall back to Ohio. By mid-afternoon, they were on the move.
Sayonara, white guys.
Campbell allotted his remaining horses to carry the women and children. The horses also carried the wounded on both sides. Those most seriously wounded were carried between 2 horses on a stretcher. Everyone else walked. The army marched only 2 miles the first day. It would take them 6 days to get back. When they arrived, most of Campbell's command were so severely frostbitten as to be incapacitated for further service. With which side won the Battle of Mississinewa is open to debate. Both sides could have an argument for the claim of victory. The Army surprised and destroyed 4 hostile Indian villages. The Indians successfully stopped the Army before it could complete its mission of doing more damage. What is certain is the War of 1812 in the West is now earnest. It would not reach a conclusion until 3 years later, in 1815. Now, because of events like this, the natives were allying with the British. You'll now notice on the field that the Battle of Mississinewa and its representation before you today is now ended. But you will soon notice British artillery entering the field. The Crown forces would come out of Canada and drop down through the frontier of America at the time. Thus, they were allying with the natives, who were being forced further west from the American military.
Get up now!
If you've been here before, those are the type of battles I was discussing earlier. The general scenarios that involve the British, the Americans, the natives, cannons, and etc.
Nobody asked to sit down yet.
Or maybe even someday, you'll have that opportunity to witness those type of battle reenactments that involve the British Crown forces, the Native Americans, the American military, cannons, and all of that excitement. We encourage you to return. As I mentioned before, you'll now notice the British Crown Force artillery entering the field. The native village is now gathering their wigwams that had been burnt on the field. This represents the allying that would have taken place.
Close up!
While you're with us today, ask as many questions as you can. Try to learn as much as you can. It's our history that we honor, the good and the bad. It all happened, and we should not forget it. That's why we do this event, to honor our past and learn for the future. So you now notice the British Crown Forces speaking with the natives, representing those allies.
So now they're big.
And how they would later work together side by side during the War of 1812.